If you asked a younger version of me, I would have told you that the first Zelda, while great in concept, was terribly flawed. I would have argued that the game's secrets were too cryptic, acting as a semblance of the archaic design seeping through. I would have professed how confusing it all was. I would have said that the combat was imprecise and frustrating. But I couldn't have been more wrong. After replaying the original Legend of Zelda, I came to a new conclusion. I now love this game. It can seem as though the Zelda series changed its identity from game to game. Back in 2011, the contrast was more noticeable than ever. The first Zelda game embraced non-linearity, letting you loose in an entire world to explore, discover, and die. A lot. Fast forward 25 years and you'll witness a game that is rigid, putting up invisible walls and barriers at every corner to restrict you and create a predefined experience. Neither approach is bad, and each provides a different take on the core of Zelda. How I came to find this was by asking one question: what's the point of Zelda? Most video games or franchises have a core, an essence, that defines them and summarizes what makes them great. Mario's essence is that the series provides platforming challenges for you to overcome. Metroid has a deadly unknown world to explore and survive. And the Mother series aims to provide a compelling, emotionally resonant narrative with witty, comedic dialogue. What I decided upon for Zelda was the following. The point is to provide an adventure, one that excites, shocks, and awes you. Entries like Breath of the Wild emphasize combat and exploration more, attempting to refine and develop them. Other games like Twilight Princess put a greater focus on plot to tell an epic tale with grand scope. Majora's Mask provided a better atmosphere and world, including some fantastic characters. All three of them are Zelda games, yet a first glance reveals few similarities. They all have dungeons, I suppose. There are puzzles to some extent, yet neither comparison encapsulates the core of each example. The three games are all offshoots of what the designers wanted, to provide an adventure. I don't think Nintendo's aim was any secret, especially with this first entry. In an interview about Zelda to celebrate the release of the NES classic, Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Zelda and Mario, was asked, quote, "Why did you decide to make The Legend of Zelda?" End quote. He responded, quote, "I wanted to bring that sense of adventure to a video game. And people playing computer RPGs back then were bragging about how strong their swordsmen had become and were calling each other at night to exchange information. When I noticed that, I thought it was an interesting social environment." End quote. From this, we can gather that The Legend of Zelda wanted three things: to be an adventure, encourage players to talk with each other, and provide a sense of progression. Despite all three objectives ostensibly being simple, the methods by which Zelda 1 accomplishes each goal are daring and distinctive. There's a certain irony to this first entry, one which I never quite saw until now. This game came out 35 years ago, yet it attempts design choices that feel unique, and it's what makes this entry so fantastic. So, let's take a look at the major aspects of Zelda 1, combat, dungeons, and exploration, and how they manifest in the impetus for the entire Zelda series. Combat in Zelda is like Mario. Your success hinges upon your precise movements and how you can dodge the enemy. Except in Zelda, there's an additional element where you have to attack back. Personally, I think it's a result of the limited controls on the NES. Only having 2 action buttons, inputs are incredibly limited. But the Zelda team took this as an opportunity to create a unique but still complex combat concept, one that relied on its movement. The movement creates a complex, satisfying combat system because of its enemy design. Lacking complex inputs from the player, the designers poured their effort into the enemy variety and complexity, paying off in spades. First, let's take a look at the controller, seeing how its simplicity influences the player and, by extension, enemy design. An NES has the simplest of controllers. For someone unaware, the device is similar to a standard controller. By similar, I mean that there are half of the face buttons, no shoulder buttons, and no analog sticks, leaving the directional pad, start, select, and 2 face buttons. In actuality, there's a large leap in depth between these two extremes. It's difficult to create complex input methods from the simple controls of the NES, which isn't meant to knock the design of those games. It's an observation, one that reveals how great design erupted from inside the game itself, not the control of a player. Limited interaction never stops designers from creating great games. Super Mario Bros. Only let you jump, run, or use a special ability, yet it was able to spawn an entire series. Its success wasn't because of the simple controls. Rather, the level design, how each stage evolved in complexity, was so impressive. Future stages borrowed concepts and challenges from previous ones to increase their complexity, providing a satisfying platforming game with significant depth. The same concept appears in the first Zelda. Instead of having complex controls to create depth, it relies on the enemy design to create challenge and complexity. Just like Mario, enemies punish you based on poor placement. Most damage is dealt when an enemy walks into you, rather than when they hit you with a weapon. The few exceptions to this are all projectiles, which affect how you move and where you place Link. Because of that, the combat is centered around movement, and how well this game utilizes its movement to create challenging, but fair, combat scenarios is the key to its success. Examining Link's available options, he can stab, move, use an additional item, open a menu to change said item, and pause the game. Having only 2 actions reflects, without a doubt, a simple combat system. There's no player complexity to be found, and changing items doesn't differ the fighting. Although, most items are still pertinent to combat, like the boomerang, bow, magic wand, etc. Despite their relevance, each one creates minimal changes in Link's playstyle. For instance, the boomerang promotes aggressive play since it stuns most opponents, allowing you to fight the enemy at close range with minimal risks involved. The magic wand and bow both favor a ranged fighting style, where you deal less damage with the benefit of better safety. The candle's another item that can have combat applications, but that seems like a side effect more than anything, since its short range encourages aggression while the flames punish you for being aggressive. Best put, it's a counterintuitive combat tool. Lastly, bombs fall under a balance of ranged and close quarters fighting, requiring Link to near an enemy before running away. As you notice, there are only 2 core playstyles for Link, close ranged or far away. Neither choice creates a complex, diverse set of tools to use, so the player complexity and customization for the first Zelda are sadly simplistic. However, all redeeming qualities of combat rely on the enemies because they're tests of skill, examining how well you can maneuver Link around the map. Examining the enemies at face value doesn't glean much about their complexity. Mechanically, the Octoroks are a single-tile entity that moves and sometimes shoots a small, ranged attack. The Pole's Voice is an enemy that moves around, except it can jump over blocks. Levers are enemies that can move, again. The gimmick here is that they disappear and reappear. Darknuts are enemies that move, but horizontally. Tektites move too, Moblins move like Octoroks, Genies move, Zoras shoot a moving projectile, Peahats move, Lynels move and chuck, Rocks move diagonally, Armos statues move fast and slow, Bubbles move, Goals move, Moldor moves, Gorias move and throw, Gibdos move, Dodongo moves, Digdogger moves, Keeses move, Zols move, Ropes move, even Gleok's head moves. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the attacks from enemies are also basic. Most of the exceptions that apply are bosses, or basic enemies that can throw or shoot projectiles. With how little variety there is, it's easy to assume that combat is boring, basic, and bad, but that isn't the case. Most any screen, whether in the overworld or the dungeons, has several enemies on screen. The beginning of the game illustrates what I mean best. Going in any direction will result in several enemies appearing on screen. If you head north, the first screen has 4 Octoroks. The eastern dead end has 4 Tektites, and your last route spawns 4 red Octoroks. Even at the start, the game piles several enemies onto you, which is how the designers create a complex battle system. Stacking enemies like what I described leads to them eventually entrapping you. Since most monsters can only deal damage when they come into contact with you, the road to victory involves moving around and dodging monsters as they approach. All of that means that combat is centered around 2-dimensional, single-plane platforming. Now, what exactly does that entail in order to create complex, worthwhile challenges? For Zelda 1, great combat encounters focus on movement, specifically precision, spacing, and timing. Precision requires you to position Link correctly, avoiding the plethora of attacks on screen. Good spacing means that you're able to stay at a reasonable distance from the enemy to attack while dodging. And great timing is about finding the opportune moment to strike without taking damage. Examining individual groups of enemies can reveal how they test several tenets of combat. Tektites, one of the more basic enemies, test your timing and spacing. In regards to the first, they have cycles of attacking and waiting that are repeated. Finding the right moment to attack in said cycle tests how well you can predict their patterns and time your assault. As for the second criterion, Tektites jolt around the screen once they're active, so these combat encounters ironically test your ability to run away. Lynels, a more complex enemy, are trials of precision and timing. Their sword beams are deadly, especially to players without any armor upgrades, and this acts as a test of your precision. Only one side of your character can block projectiles, and even then, you need the magical shield to block the swords that these centaurs throw. Having a single area to block projectiles means that you need to be precise about where you're facing. When several Lynels appear on screen, which is almost always the case, this test becomes even more challenging. These enemies also act as timing challenges since you have to gauge when their beams will appear. For that, Lynels are one of the best enemies in the overworld just because of how complex they are despite their seemingly simplistic attacks. The most complex of all enemies though is the Darknut, acting as a test of all three tenets. In regards to precision, they have a shield like you, meaning that you can only attack from the sides or back. It requires precision since you have to attack exactly where you need. Otherwise, you'll be punished. Another aspect that factors into your precision is timing, considering the fact that Darknuts can turn 90 or 180 degrees at a moment's notice. You have to rely on your own judgment as to when an attack is safe or not. Lastly, accurate spacing is central to besting the Darknut. Stabbing your sword too close to their armor results in losing precious heart containers. Considering the fact that most dungeon rooms have hordes of Darknuts, failure can result in a massive hit to your health. Zelda's ability to test all of these tenets with a variety of enemies is frankly impressive. Upon first revisiting the game, I thought the combat would be simplistic and boring. To my surprise, I found engaging, deep swordplay instead. Centering combat around movement is such a unique concept, and I think this execution deserves all the praise I've given it. With how much this combat system relies on movement, any inaccuracies or mishaps regarding the mechanic hinder the combat as well. Being one of the first Zelda games, there were bound to be technical issues, and Link's movement wasn't spared from that terrible fate. His movement suffers from rigid snapping, a phenomenon in game design that aligns the player character onto an invisible grid whenever you stop moving. One reason to implement this is to ensure that the player can traverse tight areas with ease. If this mechanic didn't exist, other problems could arise. Without snapping, it would be terribly frustrating to walk upstairs since they're one tile wide. If the collision, the boundaries that prevent you from walking on walls, is accurate to what I observed, then it is pixel perfect, meaning there is exactly one tile of space on all stairs. No more, no less. With that in mind, you would need pixel-perfect precision to climb a single set of stairs. I feel confident in my estimation considering I've dabbled enough in making games to the point where I struggled with this very issue. Moving back to Zelda, the issue is pervasive for all movement. Character snapping is frequent because the grid Link follows seems to have spaces that are a few pixels wide. The dungeon floors illustrate this best, since they feature explicit squares. As you can see, Link will phase to a location when I stop moving sometimes. Now, when's the most common instance you'll stop moving? To attack. When the shift occurs while attacking, it slightly off-puts your attack. This situation can have minimal consequences, but other times, it will graciously guide you into the path of a Darknut's turn, which is actually another problem I have. Why, oh why, do these enemies not have a visual or audio indicator for when they'll turn? It becomes frustrating to take a gamble on when to stab if I don't have a single thing to indicate danger. A few other enemies suffer from the same predicament, but due to how punishing Darknuts can be, it hurts their design the most. Octoroks surprisingly don't have the same problem. They stop moving once they're ready to fire, so it acts as a visual cue for the oncoming attack. Cues like what the Octoroks have are so necessary because then attacks become further fair tests. If you see the visual indicator in time and react accordingly, congratulations, you've mastered combat. If not, then it serves as an aspect for you to notice and improve your combat capabilities. These indicators are essential to creating fair and balanced combat systems, something that the sequel understood. Zelda 2 fixes the issue by adding a short visual cue for the same enemy, albeit with too few frames and a different perspective. Darknuts in the first entry needed something like what they received in the second, a small visual indicator that would play right before they turned. Since there isn't much animation in the first Zelda, they could have implemented something like the Octoroks. Instead of stopping though, the Darknuts would slow down before the next shift. Excusing those two minor problems, there's the final flaw with Zelda's combat. It's not developed. The problem's similar to this. Zelda 1 is a 3-layer cake with only 2 layers. Each layer on that cake constitutes a tier of complex enemies. On the bottom layer you have Octoroks, Levers, Tektites, Ropes, etc. The next layer features the Darknuts, some bosses like Gleeok, Wizrobes, and more. But there's no one to fill the third layer, which reveals how the combat, while having a great foundation, restricts its enemy design in terms of complexity, hindering the depth of fighting. To the game's credit, there are specific rooms, not enemies, that could comprise the third cake layer. Dungeon screens with statues that shoot projectiles complicate your movement options. Suddenly, all the former free space is deadly, adding complexity because it further restricts your movements. Managing both an army of Darknuts as well as a barrage of projectiles is the peak of combat complexity. It can be frustrating with the lack of visual cues for the Darknuts, but when everything lines up, the triumph afterward is sublime. The feeling of success after surviving an onslaught, having to bob and weave through what seems like a legion of attacks, cannot be overstated. The idea is so fantastic, in fact, that the designers implemented something similar in later boss rooms. Level 8 embellishes in the projectile-spewing statues, to the point where it begins to become repetitive. Look, I want this combat system to have complexity, but when the game spews out the same trick over and over and over again, it loses its luster. There isn't a single specific foe I would say reaches the same complexity as the aforementioned statue rooms, which is a shame. There are enemies that attempt to reach the coveted third cake layer, but they have some questionable, frustrating design choices that prevent them from being there. Take Ganon, the ultimate final boss of the game, the one who caused all of your turmoil. With that much build-up, you'd think he ought to be the most complex and challenging enemy of the game. Well, he suffers from a phenomenon that occurs near the end of the game: tanking. Some bosses and rooms near the later parts have encounters that are designed to tear through your supply of heart containers. I call this tanking because you have to carry on through all the damage given. I would consider it bad design because the approach doesn't encourage mastery of combat. You could argue that it rewards thorough exploration because you need heart containers, obtained through thoughtful exploration, but that doesn't promote the core tenets of great combat: precision, spacing, or timing. There's no precision to be found in the final fight, considering the fact that you can't see where the man Ganon is. Along with that, testing the player's spatial awareness is partially out of the question since you won't know where he is exactly until you lose a whole heart container, and that's with the best armor upgrade. All we're left with is timing, which is the one aspect the fight succeeds at. The Invisible Swine's projectiles appear in a consistent cycle, testing your ability to dodge projectiles under a timer while stabbing thin air in a futile effort to slay the beast. If enemies like the Darknut can successfully test all the tenets of combat, while the final boss can only accomplish the last, I think it's fair to say that Ganon's attempt to be a complex enemy was a failure at that. With as many problems as I have, the combat is complex enough to be entertaining, and when everything lines up just right, it can be good, sometimes great. You can't really express yourself through combat, but that's fine. Not every game needs to have the depth of character customization found in RPGs. What Zelda 1 succeeds at is creating enclosed encounters where the game tests your wits and movements more than how flashy or fast you can flail your sword. And for that, it succeeds. Dungeon design doesn't dabble in many puzzling concepts that'll become later staples of the series. Rather, the dungeons are focused on combat trials as well as information scarcity to create conflict, thereby establishing a different kind of dynamic for dungeons. Zelda dungeons as we know them today are typically labyrinths that combine puzzles, enemy encounters, and bosses as a way to provide conflict, and by the dungeon's end, triumphant satisfaction. Certain creations in any game will accomplish this feat better than others, but what's strange about the first entry is that the dungeons don't even attempt that standard. Not maintaining series staples isn't bad by any means, it's just perplexing how the first Zelda went about creating conflict and, afterward, a feeling of triumph. I've already discussed combat, an aspect that the dungeons revel in, so let's shift to the second part, information scarcity. Let me ask you a question. If you've played Zelda 1, have you ever felt lost? Have you felt frustrated for fumbling about and not knowing the answer? Have you felt furious for figuring out the answer because it seemed so obtuse? Well, those are problems that can arise when puzzles center around information scarcity. The concept simply means that information about the world and its dungeons is limited, and obtaining this information is central to progression. Don't believe me? Well, let's take a look anyway. In level 7, a hungry Goria blocks your path, spouting grumble grumble upon Link entering the room. It's safe to assume that the Goria has something to do with food, and considering the fact that you can't walk past the enemy, I had the assumption that it was a block to progress. Now, there are two resolutions after this point. The first is that you explored Hyrule thoroughly enough to find merchants selling meat. You either bought it, meaning that you can bypass the Goria, or you have to exit the dungeon, traversing the world to find the right merchant you need. The second, though I guess technically third, resolution is that you're stuck, and you need to explore the overworld further. This is a problem of information. If you lack any knowledge that an item about meat exists, then you can't solve the puzzle. But if you know about the slab of meat, then the blockade is easily solved. Maybe with a bit of tedium if you had to exit the dungeon. Level 5 features a similar predicament involving knowledge. The boss Digdogger is invulnerable during the first phase. Just like before, there are two outcomes. You either have the needed information, or you don't. What you need to know is located in the dungeon, inside a room with an old man, who says that Digdogger hates certain kinds of sounds. A bit cryptic in my opinion, but the hint is a piece of knowledge that hints at using the recorder you received inside this very level. Conversely, not knowing about the old man can lead to frustration and sometimes an inability to defeat the boss, depending on whether or not you have the recorder, which unfortunately is a probable possibility. The scenario resembles how, yet again, you gain knowledge through exploration, and without sufficient information, you're incapable of progressing. After entering level 7, you experience a puzzle with the old man yet again. He tells you that there's a secret in the tip of the nose, acting as a hint toward the push block puzzle located in the nose of the dungeon's layout, which resembles a lizard. The same situation occurs in level 9, another old man hinting at the main progression path for the dungeon. Without this knowledge from him, you're doomed to wander Death Mountain forever, lost and confused. While not necessary, the old man in the third dungeon explains where to find the white sword, an invaluable tool to progress that relies on information and exploration. Again. Going to level 6, another old man tells you about Dungeon 7's entrance, stating that there are secrets where fairies don't live. In level 8, the old man informs you about the entrance to Death Mountain, the final dungeon in the game, which you have to find and conquer. Level 2 has this too, featuring the infamous Dodongo Dislike Smoke, which is meant to provide information about how the boss is weak to bombs, something you can't know otherwise without some experimentation. Maybe that was too many examples, but they're still useful in proving something. Most puzzles in Zelda 1 don't rely on rules or core mechanics. The situations I described are what I'll call information puzzles, the type that crops up the most throughout Zelda 1. I want to categorize this type of puzzle because it can be successful. The old man in level 7 is one hint I particularly admire because its location is relevant to the dungeon, and it frames the puzzle as a question. What's in the nose and how do I get it? As you've probably deciphered, the information-scarce puzzle design of Zelda 1 isn't consistent. The lack of consistency occurs when there's too much ambiguity. Creating uncertain hints is welcome, since otherwise there wouldn't be a puzzle. However, the detrimental ambiguity can stem from more than the actual hint itself. If information is irrelevant to a dungeon or nearby location, frustration often ensues. In level 5, for instance, our favorite friendly old man states, "Secret power is said to be in the arrow." The word secret implies something more than a normal arrow, so I assumed there was an arrow upgrade imminent. Except it was only imminent if the word meant several hours later at the game's climax. The amount of time and distance that separates this hint from when it's actually relevant is mind-boggling. The divide is too wide, blurring the hint's actual meaning since you hear about it too early. Even then, the phrasing itself is too ambiguous if you aren't familiar with the Zelda series. Arrow upgrades are quite common, so I was aware of what was coming, but you might not be. A previous secret I talked about, the one from the old man in level 8 about Death Mountain, suffers the same problem. As a wise man once said, Spectacle Rock is an entrance to death. Two problems here. First, utilizing location names in a game that doesn't have an in-game map or a whole lot of text is inadvisable at the very least. Second, the one way in which the hint makes sense is only if you know about Death Mountain as a location in the Zelda series. Granted, the volcano was popularized by future entries, but usually it's not a dungeon, which highlights how alluding to the location's name isn't effective if the name is applied to a different context. In a different scenario where the old man referred to level 9 directly, I'd appreciate the hint a lot more for expounding upon the information-scarce dungeon design for Zelda 1. As it is now, this example is disappointing and frustrating. Other hints can be frustrating in their own inventive ways too. Go to the next room and ones who does not have Triforce can't enter spring to mind, both suffering from a feudal existence. Their removal would have little if no bearing on the game. although this is probably the result of creating information-based dungeons. If hints or dialogue aren't useful, the dungeons as a whole suffer. To be fair, the main focus is and has always been combat. See the section on combat if you're curious about my thoughts on it, but the secondary focus of dungeons still deserves critique. Surprisingly, it became the greater focus of Zelda titles, starting with A Link to the Past. Of course, my thoughts on the issue are from the lens of someone who's experienced a whole league of Zelda games before this entry. Before that, the puzzles were creative. Disappointing at points, but still creative. As important as puzzles are, I feel like they don't matter as much as the combat and exploration for Zelda 1, the second being one of the most pivotal and integral parts of the Zelda experience. Link is such a fantastic character because he allows you to become an adventurer, something which other media can't do. You can witness an adventure unfold in a film, you can read about an epic from a novel, but becoming the adventurer is a conundrum. Sure, there are tabletop board games like Dungeons & Dragons allowing you to create your very own adventurer. However, the limitations of video games required Nintendo to create a vessel, the perfect character to link the player with what was happening in the game. Because of that limitation, the Zelda team created a game in which you feel the same loneliness, confusion, and triumphs as Link, without him ever expressing a single word. The construction surrounding Link's character is what defines the exploration found in Zelda 1. The most significant and praiseworthy feature is the map design. Starting the game, you have a map in the corner of the screen, and upon finishing the game, you will never find a map of the overarching world. There are rough maps of each dungeon. To find that precious information, though, you have to thoroughly explore every space of the dungeon. Even after obtaining a layout of the level, you can't view the pathways to each room, and sometimes there are even secret rooms that hide pivotal items or pathways. The process, therefore, necessitates exploration in spite of the fact that maps most often hinder one's desire to explore. On the other hand, the overworld never has anything akin to a map. The most you'll get is a gray rectangle in the top left portion of the screen, informing you about Link's general position. Because of that lacking information, discoveries are more potent than ever. For once, you have to do everything a traveler would. The sparse, almost non-existent story aids that quality. You enter the game world with little to no context as to what's happening. Even if you read the opening crawl, you'll only understand the purpose and inevitable goal of your quest. You don't know the layout of the land, the enemies you'll face, or the people you can encounter. It's all a secret, beckoning your curiosity. Secrets, then, become the main source of discovery during the adventure. Secrets can range from obscure to quite obvious, but the satisfaction from finding one cannot be overstated. To the game's credit, the required secrets aren't that obscure. That may sound surprising, considering Zelda 1's infamous reputation with cryptic clues, but let me help elucidate first. There aren't many secrets you necessarily need to beat the game. In order to access the northwestern part of the world, you don't even need the path through the Lost Woods as long as you have the ladder. Likewise, the magical sword isn't required to beat the game. Tedious as it may be, the wooden sword is the only weapon you'll need to defeat Ganon. Besides the silver arrows, that is. Despite that, there are certain secrets that most players will find before finishing the game. The aforementioned hints fall under this category, so let's take a look at how obscure they actually are. Killing anything late game without the magical sword is a chore, so discovering it feels necessary. Likewise, the path through the Lost Woods is the only terrestrial path to the northwest, so if you're like me, you'll find a way through early on. With regards to the second secret, there's an old woman in the furthest southwestern point of the map. After paying her the middle amount of rupees, she tells you the route through the Lost Woods, a secret which most players will use to explore the northwestern territory before obtaining the ladder. You don't need to have a bomb for this either. She waits in an already open cave, beckoning you to enter it. The hint about the magical sword is from an old woman only 2 screens west of the game's starting point, meaning that this is potentially one of the first secrets you could encounter. Of course, finding which grave houses the old man is quite tedious, but after touching a grave that can't be moved, a genie will appear. The newly spawned enemies at least reduce the tedium. Both of the aforementioned examples reveal that exploration is heavily reliant on hints. In the prior section, I discussed how most puzzles in Zelda 1 are information-based, meaning that progression is reliant on what secrets or information you're aware of. The same thing happens for the secrets in the overworld. Therefore, the exploration is also information-based to a small extent. Despite the consistent use of information for secrets and puzzles, the exploration really suffers due to the cryptic nature of certain hints. The most infamous of these being found in level 1, where an old man states, "Eastmost Peninsula is the secret." This dialogue is so ambiguous that people, myself included, aren't certain about what it's referring to. Trying to find a hint in the original Japanese text doesn't work either, since the Japanese equivalent states that you need money in order to fire arrows. For the sake of clarity, I'm going to assume that this refers to the secret moblin located one screen north of this eastmost peninsula on the map. Based on that assumption, this is an absurd asinine hint because to find the moblin, you need to walk through a wall with no indication that you can do something like that. Even ignoring my assumption, the absurd ambiguity of the original hint isn't warranted. Granted, this secret moblin isn't a required discovery, but it reveals the questionable design for secrets in Zelda 1. However, investigating other hint-based secrets demonstrates that there is a lot of potential for the system. Two instances involving the old man reflect this the best. The first one occurs in level 4. Inside the dungeon he states, "Walk into the waterfall." My first response was, which damn waterfall? But after reflecting on the experience I realized that there was only a single waterfall on the entire map. This alone imbues the waterfall with suspicion, but this dialogue from the old man all but confirms that there's a secret there. The situation laid out here is so fascinating because it highlights what information-based exploration needed more of: suspicion. Creating suspicious or questionable landmarks signifies that there's something amiss, acting as a clue to help you discover a secret. The next example continues the same idea. Exploring the top row of the map, you'll find an old man who presents a blue map to you saying, "Show this to the old woman." Not specifying which old woman may seem like cryptic design, but it's actually not. Close to where Link spawns, you can find an old woman who says nothing when you enter her cave. The lack of text creates suspicion about her character, and once you bring her the old man's note, she finally speaks. The old man's hint, therefore, informs you about the importance of looking for a strange or suspicious old woman. And after that, finding the right person isn't that difficult. Combining secrets and suspicious landmarks is such a creative approach to facilitating exploration. Though there are some misfires, especially with regards to the secret moblins, I don't mind them too much. The cryptic secrets can hinder my desire to explore the land of Hyrule, but nevertheless, I admire Nintendo's first approach. Really, it cuts down to the core of what makes Zelda 1 so cherished. It emulates traditional design facets, exploration, combat, etc., in an ironically new way. Zelda 1 encapsulates what makes the series so great, but not in the traditional way. The puzzles certainly are unfamiliar, even to series veterans like myself. Information is prided above anything else, such as pattern recognition, spatial awareness, etc. The combat is movement-based, and it's an interaction that the series forever fled from with each passing sequel. Preceding 2D entries like A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening certainly contain fragments of Zelda 1's combat, but a sword slash, as opposed to a stab, transforms fighting more than you think. Despite everything, the core of Zelda has remained the same. Discovery is a powerful feeling. It instills surprise, wonder, and joy in so many players, including myself. I cannot find any other series that has its identity centered around discovery. None but The Legend of Zelda. This game series has excited, shocked, and awed me my whole life. Examining the first entry with the foresight of what would come after is surreal to say the least. Even by the standards of modern Zelda, the core design of the first entry is still so unique, and the Legend of Zelda would only grow from there. Thank you so much for watching this video. Consider subscribing, liking, sharing, and all that other BS if you want to. Ostensibly, there's a statistic that says about it's only 4.8 or 4.6% of you who are subscribed, but if you look real closely, it says watch hours, so I don't know how exact that is. I'm guessing it's more like 8% or something, but I'd appreciate it if you still subscribe. You can always change it later or whatever. I do genuinely want to thank you for watching this video, any of my videos, especially the Xenoblade video. Thank you to everyone who's come here from that and supported me. I appreciate you all so much. There will be future long-form content from here on out, and consider putting games in the comments that you would want me to discuss, analyze, or review, because I'm always open to anything, basically. Even JRPGs at this point. I've kind of gone over my hump of, I don't like JRPGs, so we'll see how that turns out. Anyway, I may be cynical, but I wish you the very best.